Okay, I'm bringing this slide up here just to make sure that everybody has that right, okay? These are the ones that I show you having selected. And Clara still, I'm gonna work with her on getting one of them, okay? And I have updated the course schedule on Canvas, so you should see your name with the individual that you're gonna be presenting, all right? My wife and I just started the one on, let's see, which one did we just finished John and John Wesley and his wife. That was kind of a sad one, actually. Okay, so just double checking with you to make sure that we're all good to go on that. Okay. Get this back down, this back up. And here we go. All right. We're going to talk about a man named Boniface. That was not his given name. His given name was Winifred or something like that. Remember, these are translations. And if you read about Boniface, you probably noted that he was from what church, what religion?
Was he a Catholic?
Yeah, he was a Roman Catholic. One of the things that you have to remember about the Roman Catholic Church, and you probably studied this in Western Civ, is that the Catholic Church didn't become everything it is today all of a sudden. I mean, you can walk through the first several hundred years, pretty much right up to the Reformation and even beyond, and find things being added to the Catholic Church. It kind of evolved. The word Catholic means what, literally? It means universal. So when the word was first presented, first became used, it was a simple reference to the totality of the church. It was the Catholic Church. But it took on a particular meaning as the Catholic Church as we know it today began to form. Remember that Paul eventually went to Rome, and Rome, after the death of the apostles, became more and more central and more powerful in the church, which makes sense because Rome was the capital of the empire. And so the Bishop of Rome became more and more powerful and eventually morphed into what we know as the Pope and all that. Germany is divided pretty equally between Lutheran and Catholic, right? And if I remember correctly, is it Lutheran in the north and Catholicism in the south? Yeah. And so you look at a guy like Boniface, who's a missionary, but he's a missionary early on, and the Catholic Church that he was a part of isn't the same Catholic Church that we know today. You could look up decrees and declarations of popes throughout the years, and you would see that it's strung out over a long period of time. So don't automatically associate him with what we know the Catholic Church to be today. Actually, the Catholic Church even today the Pope is very different from the other popes. I don't know if you followed that at all, but he's very open to change, and he talks to the LGBTQ community saying, who am I to judge? This is the Pope. And he's taking a position that's very relaxed and very open rather than that position that the Catholic Church is used to having, a man there that says, no, this is what we believe, so on. So they're undergoing some interesting things today. So why do we include Catholic missionaries in this course? I knew you would ask that question, so I decided to ask it. Actually, the author, Ruth Tucker, I wrote her an email, I don't know, probably now 8 years ago, maybe 10. And I asked her that question because a lot of the missionaries that you'll read about in the early pages were Catholics. So I said, why do you devote so much time in your book to Catholic missions? Any guess as to how she may have responded to my email? Can you imagine why maybe Catholic missions are emphasized early on?
Were they the only type of missions back then?
Not the only kind, but...
The best kind?
Well, I wouldn't use the word best. But we
They
had
have the
better,
most support, maybe?
pardon?
They have like the most resources?
They had, yes, they had power, they had political connection, they had money. And so they were able to promote missions, and the records that they kept were far more preserved than other. In fact, the Catholic Church, as time went on, began to destroy records of other missionary movements because they wanted to be the only church. They believed they were the only church. And so, you put all that together, and we have very little left historically to substantiate what happened in true Christianity in the early centuries. We do have some, but not nearly as much. So that's why. And it's good to talk a little bit about Catholic missions just because they do bear the name Christian, even though we don't understand them as true Christians. So historically speaking, it is legitimate at least to observe what happened to some degree. He was born in Devonshire, in England. Anybody here of English background? Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you think that time that there were more Catholics or like that were part of the Catholic Church that were actually Christians than today?
Yeah, it definitely. Because, like I said, it was something that kind of evolved over time. So at the beginning, there were a lot of true believers who we would call Catholics in a technical sense. But as time went on and more emphasis was placed on baptism of infants and work salvation, buying indulgences and all those sorts of things. Yeah, I mean, even today, you will find true Christians to some degree in the Catholic Church, right? Now, if they're true Christians, there's one or two problems. Either they don't really understand the doctrine of the Catholic Church that they're still in, or they have had a really hard time getting out because of family and friends, community pressure, things like that. So, yeah, that's a good question. So he was born in late 7th century, which would be the 600s, in England. And he entered a monastery and became a priest. When you think of monasteries, you often think of the Catholic Church. In another book that I read a few years ago, the author did a really good job of explaining two different kinds of monasteries that were developed. When you think of a monastery, what comes to your mind? Why would a person enter a monastery?
Isn't that when they confess their sins to the priest?
Well, no, you can do that right in the Catholic Church. Yeah, you don't need to be a part of a monastery to do that. Monastery is an actual location where they would go and live. Any idea, Matthew?
I thought it was like where they like go and just like stay there forever, like a monastery or whatever. That's probably something else.
No, you're right. They would. I guess what I'm asking is why.
Like some crisis going on, and they just like decided to change their mind, just go do something else.
Okay, yeah, crisis. In their minds, the crisis was the corruption of the world, and so some of them would go to a monastery in order to escape the corruption of the world. It was a way of spiritual isolation for them. Okay. You've heard of the Essenes, right? That would have existed during the time of Christ and even before. They did the same thing. They were Jews, and they left Jerusalem because of the corruption. They believed that the Messiah was going to come soon, and they wanted to be ready to receive him with purity. And so they fled from, didn't flee, but they left Jerusalem, and they established Qumran. If you heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and those are the guys, the Essenes, are the ones that preserve the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran. And so that was their idea, to escape the corruption of the world. But there was a second reason why some monasteries were established. Any guesses on that?
From what I've heard, a lot of people entered the monastery because they wanted to follow God and they wanted to learn more about him. So it was like a place dedicated to learning about God, studying the scriptures, memorizing, and just focusing. And like in most monasteries, I don't know if this is the right time period, but they weren't allowed to get married. Mm-hmm. And so then it was just part of the belief that if they went to a monastery, they were more holy or more God-fearing men.
Yeah. Yeah, the monasteries were all males at that time. And as far as I know, they always were, but I'm not sure about that. Yeah, so the whole idea of the Catholic doctrine of celibacy kind of grew out of that. So some of them would go to learn and memorize and meditate and all that in order to become pure. That same idea of isolation from the world. Others went and did that same thing in order to become missionaries. So for some of them, the idea was escaping impurity, and for some, it was to prepare to be missionaries.
Didn't Martin Luther do that?
He was a monk. Yeah, he was in a monastery. And for how long, I don't remember, but yeah, he was. All right. Well, he struggled early on, and he was actually backed by the Pope. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of articles, just little segments of articles that I found online in just a moment that talk more about that. Like most Catholic missionaries, he depended on the financial backing of the papacy, the Catholic Church, in order to do his work. What happens, I mean, if the papacy is financing your missionary work, then how is that going to impact your work?
You only do what they want.
Exactly. You become really, in a sense, a servant of the Catholic Church. But even today, if missionaries go and raise support, they're going to raise support in churches of like faith and practice because they need to satisfy the expectations of their supporters. Okay? And he had a hard time, and the way he got out of his hard time was by seeking the financial backing of the Pope, and he got it. He did something that not many missionaries have done over the years. He's focused on the upper classes. There's another missionary that we probably will not get to this semester. His name was Matthew Ricci, R-I-C-C-I, Italian. And he did the same thing. He and his brother also ministered to the upper class. Some of you know missionaries who are in upper class ministries?
I've heard of some who go to Hollywood to be missionaries to like Hollywood families and actors.
Okay. That's got to be challenging.
Mhm.
Any of you familiar, you're probably all familiar with Ron Self, who spoke in our missions conference a couple years ago. His son, he's got a son, Mark Self. He's got a son, Andrew Self. Andrew's in Argentina working in an upper class community in Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina. And it's a tough ministry. And as a result, he has to raise more money because of the type of people he's reaching. It's easy for people in that situation to kind of wonder, must be nice to be missionary to upper class people because you get to live a nice, and sometimes, unfortunately, people who try to work in upper class communities face criticism for that. Okay? And I know Andrew and Romina. He married Romina, who was an Argentine. They're really, really neat people, doing a good job for the Lord. But that's what Boniface did. Have you heard of the sacred, or you read about the reading of the sacred oak of the thunder god? Actually, I'm ahead of the game here a little bit. So maybe you haven't read this yet. So when he was ministering in a certain place, he challenged the pagans in that area. They were very superstitious, and there was a particular oak tree, and they believed that a thunder god lived under that, and if you ever did anything to the oak tree or made the thunder god mad, he could wreak havoc on you. And so he took an axe, according to church history. Okay, he grabbed an axe and he boldly chopped the oak tree down, and everybody waited in suspense for something horrible to happen, and it never happened. And that's the way that he convinced them that their gods were worthless. They were powerless. Okay. Again, when you think about hagiography, you have to remember that sometimes these stories get embellished a little bit. But something else he did, ladies, he used women in ministry. We're talking about a period of time when women really, you didn't associate women with ministry, at least leadership in any way. But he was willing to give women important roles in ministry. To what extent he did that, I can't tell you. But he used women in ministry. And we're going to come across a few others that did that going against the grain. Even in the 1800s, there were a lot of people that believed that women should never have a voice, like on a mission field. They should always just take care of the children. And we're going to study people like Lottie Moon and Amy Carmichael and others that wrestled with that sort of thing. Now, here's an article, and you can hardly read the writing, the source down here, but it's from Christianity Today. Some of you may be familiar with the magazine. And it's an article on Boniface, and really I pulled it up primarily because of the very first sentence. His first job as a missionary was a failure. I haven't counted, but there are quite a few missionaries in this book who would have that same testimony. You read about them at the beginning, they just wrestle. I just mentioned Amy Carmichael. She was one of them. She went all over the place. She's here, there, with just having a hard time settling in. And every year I like to mention that because some of you may experience that. You kind of envision, okay, I do my preparation and I get into my work and off we go. And some experience that, but not everybody. And when that happens, what's the temptation? You give up. You feel, okay, I'm either God didn't call me or I'm not connected with God enough to hear it. All kinds of ideas go through your mind. And for whatever reason, God knows this perfectly. He allows some people to go through that because he knows they need that as part of their preparation. That's all I can tell you. It doesn't mean we should be sloppy and just, be aimless. But here's a guy that was very intentional about what he was doing, okay? He was even offered a nice, lucrative position in a bishopric in the church. He turned it down because he believed God wanted him to be a missionary. And yet when he went, this is what happened. See, when that happens, man, it's just really easy to feel like, I don't know, maybe I've misunderstood something here along the way. Okay. Notice his name was really Winfrith or Winfrid. He wanted to be a traveling evangelist since missionary monks had visited his family's home when he was 5 years old. Anybody here feel attracted to missions as a very young person, a young child? Laura, how old were you?
7.
What was it that did that?
I don't really know. I don't know if I read I think I read a bunch of books about missions. And whenever we'd have missionaries come to our church, I was just fascinated by it. And I knew that I wanted to share the gospel with people someday.
That's neat. Anybody else? Was he young?
I don't remember what age, but I just liked reading the books because they were exciting.
So it was books. Yeah. Really cool. Anybody else? I didn't get saved when I was 14, but it wasn't long after that I sensed that God wanted me in ministry somewhere, somehow. Didn't know it would be a missionary. All right. He'd given up a successful life as a Benedictine monk, having written the first Latin grammar produced in England. And the guy was sharp. He was very intelligent. Poems and treatise on metrics. What does metrics have to do with all that? You read Matthew Rickey, I just mentioned him. He was also a mathematician. And God uses all kinds of things. Boniface is a nickname given to him. It's from the Greek bone, means good, and I think face is the Latin for face, a good face. I looked it up. It's a word that can mean like well-favored or fortunate, that kind of idea. The Pope actually gave him that name when he saw the success he was having later on in his ministry. All right, here's another article that comes from Encyclopedia Britannica. So great was his success that he was called to Rome, where Gregory consecrated him a missionary bishop. Now you see what's happening? He's kind of being sucked in to the umbrella of the Pope. Pope provided him with a collection of cannons. Of course, he can shoot people. No, that's a dumb joke. These are writings, ecclesiastical regulations. Okay, you know that this is not scripture. These canons were declarations by the Pope or the Church. They were additions to the Bible, and that's where the problems really get bad.
So is that kind of where like the extra or different books of the Bible came in for the Catholic Bible?
No, not necessarily. That was another thing. The Catholics accepted the apocryphal books. Many of them are very good reading, but they're not inspired. And even today, many Catholics will consider the Apocrypha to be what they call a deuterocanon, which is a secondary canon. They would almost believe in two levels of inspiration. The books that we claim to be inspired, and then the second canon, deuterocanon, which is in some way not quite on the same level as the regular canon of Scripture. Yeah. But popes would make declarations, or councils would, papal councils would make these papal bulls, they call them, and declarations, and those would often become sacred by the church. Very, very sad. Notice he also gave him letters of recommendation to be able to have access to people through personages such as Charles Martel. Does that name ring a bell to you? Charles Martel. If it doesn't, right now it will in a few minutes if we get into it today. I'm almost positive you guys have studied Charles Martel before. You guys all had Western Civ? I know there's 150 million things to study in Western Civ movements, but a major religious historical movement was impacted by Charles Martel. Martel is a nickname that means hammer. Charles the Hammer. All right.
So his grandson was Charlemagne.
Charlemagne?
Yeah, and so I remember that.
Charles the
from
Great, who
Western Civ.
became one, yeah, okay. Okay, well, hang on, we'll come back. Anyway, Charles was the master of the Frankish kingdom, and so he would offer protection to Boniface. Do you see the political connections going on here? Popes in Rome, he has buddies who are political leaders in other places in the world, so he can send his messengers to those places to get protection, get support. That's why the Catholic Church had such an advantage, beginning all the way through. And in fact, it was the pagan awe of Martel's name that allowed Boniface to destroy the sacred oak of the Germanic god Thor that we talked about, the sacred oak that he chopped down. I don't know what's behind all that, the details of that influence with Martel, but anyway. So we'll get back to Charles Martel. Is this, okay, just a minute. I think I may have made a mistake on my, I did just a second. Yeah, okay, I'll correct that. Here's the guy I'm looking for. Raymond Lull. Now, Raymond Lull is a totally different kind of a creature. His name is spelled a number of ways because, again, we're translating it, but I think the most common way is the third one there, at least in English. Okay. I don't know if he's known in Germany. Does that name ring a bell to you? Okay. Some call, well, notice down here, he was a writer, a poet, a theologian, a mystic, mathematician, logician, martyr. He's not smoking weed here, okay? No, that's not what that is. Okay. Those words on there is what I'm quoting down here. So it's really a crazy picture, but it is the most popular picture or drawing of him that you'll find. But he was another one of these guys. Look, mathematician, there it goes again. A lot of these guys just, that's an interesting study. Why were so many of these guys who were influential even in politics and religion also good mathematicians? Maybe it's the logic, they were able to think and put things together. I don't know. But he was also, this one right here, a mystic. One of the articles I read on him, I think it was Britannica, that mentioned that he was very influential in mysticism in the area where he was serving. So you almost asked the question, was the guy even a Christian? I think there's enough evidence to say was one of the things we have to remember is that we are heirs of an incredible heritage of theology. We buy books, we go to classes, and the things that we study in theology are things that have been wrestled with and debated for hundreds of years. And here we are, recipients of all of that, you know? Some of these guys were true believers, but they were messed up in some areas. You know, I mean, look at today, even like in the Pentecostal church, for example. You got people who are true believers, but they practice forms of mysticism too, dreams, visions, and things that really have a bit of a pagan label on them, you know? And so I think the guy was a Christian. The impression I get is he really did know the Lord, but he also dabbled in some other things. He was syncretistic. Remember that word? The union of certain ideas, contrasting ideas together. And so he was known as Dr. Illuminatus, whatever that means. So he lived during the time of the early Islamic invasion, which was right around the early 600s. Okay, so about the same time as Boniface. And so now, what is that a map of? Well, it's the early Islamic invasions. Okay. By the way, this is probably a map that you should be at least a little bit familiar with, because this invasion of Islam that headed in this direction really defined the main parameters of the Islamic kingdom that endure to this day. It's not a kingdom today in a sense, but even today, when you look at North Africa and the Middle East, and even some parts of Europe, but this is what happened and what continues to be today as a result of the Islamic invasion. In Africa today, Islam is trying to head, farther and farther south and dominate the entire, and they are in the south. If you go to Mozambique, which isn't even on this map, it's way down here, the northern part is very strongly Muslim. Okay, so so the Islamic advance headed this way, and then it's turned toward Europe, and it was stopped in France. Okay, and who was the man who finally stopped the Islamic advance in France?
Oh, the hammer guy,
Charles Martel. That's the guy we just saw. Just read about. Right, Battle of Tours, France. And when that happened, he pretty much that spelled pretty much the end of the Muslim advance at that time, at least the very quick advance that took place over a few hundred years. Okay, so that's why it stops right there, France.
But now it's spread even more down to Africa.
Yeah, although it is spreading in Europe as well. I mean, England has really undergone some struggles with that, and some have even suggested that England could eventually become an Islamic state. That may be a bit of a politicized exaggeration, but they still are very much present in Europe. But yeah, here and over here, they continue their stronghold in this area. Mm-hmm. So Charles Martel, and so he becomes kind of an icon. The pagans kind of almost worship him as a god because of what he did to stop. Because the Muslims were, I mean, they didn't go in and offer salvation, message. They went in and said, you either convert to Islam or you lose your head. And so, yeah. So Raymond Lull, by the way, what was the Christian response to the Islamic advance called?
The Crusades.
Exactly, the Crusades. I would just tell you, we've come in evangelicalism to avoid using the word crusades. Now, you remember Billy Graham, he had crusades. When I was a kid, there was a common thing that he's having a crusade in Minneapolis, having a crusade in Atlanta, having a crusade in Tokyo. And they were all called crusades. But that was back before we really started having more interaction with the Muslim people. And now, because of the Crusades, the Christian response to the Islamic advance, we try to avoid that. In fact, if you talk to a Muslim today about the Lord, one of their biggest criticisms of Christianity is that. Now you could say, well, what about you guys? But you don't want to get into that tit for tat conversation because the Christian crusades did not reflect Jesus' teaching about advancing the gospel. It was all done by force, the power of the Pope, power of politics. Matthew?
I was to ask the question, I think you answered, like, I know what a crusade was, like a Christian crusade. So you said it was done by like, the Pope, like forcefully?
Yeah, the Catholic Church reacted to the Muslim by going in and just slaughtering and you know taking back many of the places that had been occupied by Islam. But the Islamic impact remained, as we said, still to this day. So there's a lot of hatred, a lot of hurt on both sides, you know, because of that. Christians are to be known by our love and not by you know, using force. By the way, will God ever use force to bring the world to himself when?
When he comes back.
After the tribulation, come back to establish his kingdom. Yeah, he'll rule with a rod of iron. Okay. Well, we're just going to stop at time. It's time to go. Lull was born in 1232. We'll come back to Lull here. We're a little ahead, so that's good. And just so don't forget, Monday there's no class. Next class is Wednesday. You have read Tucker 44 to 60 by then. So, all right. Thank you all very much. Enjoy your weekend.